Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of Scholarly Snippets. I'm your host, Stephen Sorensen. Today, I'm joined by a guest with a bachelor's degree in international studies and a master's in history, with a focus on modern U.S. and Latin American history. He's currently a non student teacher's assistant, and it's essentially a world history class that he teaches. He's also the host of a podcast called A Mouthful of History. David, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well, all things considered. How about yourself?
I'm in the same boat. So, this is my podcast slash talk show where I interview people that have degrees in history or are pursuing degrees in history or have unrelated degrees but like a passion for history. And so, it's a really history focused podcast. You yourself are very interested in history. What got you interested originally?
So it was kind of a gradual process for me. When I was growing up, like in the K through 12 system, history did honestly back then kind of feel like a list of names and dates and abstract facts that didn't feel super relevant to my life. I had a history teacher in 10th grade, Mr. Green, for AP Euro, that kind of started to change that for me a little bit. He did a really good job of connecting the past to the present and making us think about things. But even then, like he made me appreciate it a little bit more, but it still wasn't something I was super interested in. But in college, actually, I began to get more interested in like the social sciences and humanities, even though I never took a history class at my community
Hmm.
college, Palomar. But then after I transferred to UC Irvine, I was taking international studies classes that were like cross-listed as history because it was mostly like Latin American history classes I was taking, and those classes just really did it for me. And from then on, I was really into history.
So yeah, you got your bachelor's from UC Irvine. Did you go to school prior to that for something else?
So I started out at community college because basically, like when I was on the verge of graduating high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do at all. And so I started at Palomar College, which was a community college. And I came in as a philosophy major, which I would go on to change a bunch of times. But I was there for 3 years before I transferred to UC Irvine.
So yeah, you said you changed your major. You started out as a philosophy major. Then did you get into international studies after that, or was there anything in between?
So there actually was something in between. I, while I was at Palomar, I changed from philosophy to social and behavioral sciences. And then when I transferred to UC Irvine, because there wasn't such a thing as just like social sciences as your major, I was a social policy and public service major. And I took an international studies class for fun. Actually, two of them. One that was like just about international studies itself, like a core international studies type class, and then also a history about revolutionary Latin America during the 20th century. And I just liked them so much, and I eventually felt more and more kind of disconnected from my social policy and public service major
Hmm.
that I just made the switch over.
Interesting. So yeah, you got your master's in history, with your focus on the Latin American history and modern U.S. What? How long did it take you to get both of your bachelor's and your master's? Like, how many years did you invest in this?
So I was at UC Irvine for 2 and 2/3 of the school year because the UC system, unlike most other colleges, works on the quarter system. And so after I transferred, I spent 2 whole years at Irvine and then also the fall and winter quarters of my last school year there. So I was done before spring quarter. And then at SDSU, I was there for 2.5 years.
So what are we looking at here? Like 5 years, 5 years total, maybe six.
Yeah, basically about 5 years. And then if you count community college, then 8 years.
All right, so we'll say 8 years. Over these last, or over the 8 years that you spent in school and getting these degrees, what were your favorite parts of getting those degrees?
So for undergrad in general, both at Palomar and at UC Irvine, I was actually really connected to campus life, which I really enjoyed. I was involved in activism. I was involved in speech and debate. In addition to that, I also was doing martial arts and stuff, but kind of more directly in the classroom. I actually really enjoyed the lectures of courses I was interested in. I was the kind of student who I honestly rarely did the readings, but I pretty much always went to lecture. And if it was a lecture I enjoyed, such as the Revolution in Latin America class that I took, like I was there, even if basically, unless I was like really sick or had some sort of emergency, I was there and I was paying attention. I was taking notes.
Cool. So to summarize that, you'd say the community aspect, uh, being around other kind of like-minded individuals, but also the lectures too, and definitely not the reading, from what I heard. um,
Yeah, and that started to change in grad school for me. So with grad school, of course, for those of you who have had the fortune of not being in grad school, you really do have to do the readings, and so that was a big adjustment for me. And the way it's basically structured is for any class that is just for grad students in the history program, it you're doing these things called seminars where every week in each class you have a book that you have to read, and then you are just analyzing the book. You're analyzing the sources it uses, the approach that the historian takes, the general subject matter, just a number of different things. And so you're really trying to analyze the book as one historian really seriously analyzing a piece of work. And so there are a couple discussions that I really enjoyed. And so that was probably my favorite part in the classroom for graduate school. But my just absolute favorite experience in graduate school was when I TA'd for a second half US history class, which was US after the Civil War, so Reconstruction and onward to the present. TAing for that class just really, really showed me that I wanted to be an
and
educator.
that's being a teacher's assistant for people who might not be familiar with the acronym.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah, that was being a teacher's assistant.
Yeah, that's cool. Um, so on the other side of that, what were some challenges that you faced over the years, dealing with school? Yeah, I know you kind of just mentioned the reading, being difficult at first, but it kind of sounds like you grew to like it a bit. So
Yeah,
I
I
don't know.
absolutely did.
So yeah, what kind of challenges did you face? Let's hear about some of those.
So I come from a low income family. Actually, my mom is first generation from Tijuana. She grew up in LA in the low income parts. My dad is basically for lack of a better way of putting it, like a white redneck from the south. And so my family, even though my mom and dad had kind of like worked themselves into like sort of like lower middle class and all that, like we didn't have a lot of the resources that a lot of other people, a lot of my like classmates and cohort had, particularly at UC Irvine and even SDSU. So just trying to kind of financially make it during higher education was probably my biggest challenge. But in graduate school, it was just the workload because you need to take three courses to be considered full time, and then in each course you're reading one book a week and doing other assignments on top of that. And then
Is that like
in a,
three books a week if you're doing three courses?
exactly, you're reading three books a week.
Hmm.
And in addition to that, I personally was also working for the 5 semesters that I was there. Three of those I worked as a grading assistant, where I graded assignments for a professor, and then another one I worked as a TA, as I mentioned before. And so I was doing that, and then I was also working at an elementary school at an after-school program, which I really loved. But working a job to pay rent, in addition to working in higher education, and doing your grad degree was just a lot to balance. And on top of that, I was also trying to keep up with my martial arts training as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of spinning plates that you had going there. And definitely, I think a lot of people are going to relate to the challenge of finances because schooling is just becoming increasingly expensive and degrees are becoming more and more common, which means that they're worth less in the end run. And so, yeah, I can see how that would definitely pose a challenge to overcome. And it looks like you did, in the end, overcome the challenges because you're sitting here today with your bachelor's and your master's. And you're still currently working as a teacher's assistant, from what I understand, right? And have you been keeping up with your martial arts, or?
I had been up until the whole quarantine epidemic thing, but yeah, I've been able to stay pretty consistent throughout the years. I've been training for consistently for about 12 years, but in different martial arts. So I'm not like an expert in anything.
Great. So, do you have any plans to pursue other degrees?
As of right now, no. But I also hadn't planned to pursue anything after my bachelor's. So who's to know what the future holds? But as of now, no.
Right. So, if you were to pursue one, what would you go for? Do you have any ideas?
I would probably go for history, but I'm not completely sure about that. But probably history.
And would you go for another master's or a PhD?
That's a great question. Actually, if I went for a PhD, it would for sure, or not for sure, but it would very, very likely be history. I have flirted with the idea of going back to school for another master's, actually going to SDSU as a, or excuse me, UCSD as a student. And they have kind of the equivalent of international studies there. I believe the major there is called global policy studies, but it's considered one of the best like international studies, international relations type schools like in the world. So if I went back for another master's, it would actually probably be that.
Cool. So, let's talk about your thesis or your lack thereof. You told me that you did two comprehensive exams instead of doing a thesis. How did you even hear? Like, how did that come about? I've never heard of somebody doing a comprehensive exam in place of their thesis.
Yeah, so it makes sense that you haven't heard of that because it's actually been a really relatively recent thing. From what I heard from STSU, I want to say it's been like the last like 5 to 10 years where that's even become an option for a graduate degree. But basically, the thinking behind the comprehensive exams is that not everyone is going on to get a PhD. And so, if you're trying to get a master's in history, say to work as like a high school history teacher or a community college professor, or even a job like outside of education, like for example, a museum curator or historical society or something like that, then the comprehensive exams can be a good option because the way it works is you choose two subjects, and for both of those subjects, you read 40 books each for that subject. And so for me, it was second half U.S. history, so again everything after the Civil War, covering a variety of topics, and then 20th century revolution and counter revolution in Latin America. So those were my two topics.
That's interesting. So basically, because you can write a comprehensive exam, you have to at least be like have a comprehensive understanding of the knowledge. So that makes sense as to how that would pass for a thesis project. So, or the what is it, a capstone project? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, that's what they call it at SDSU. I'm not sure if that's what they call it other places, but yeah, basically the big cumulative project that actually lands you the degree.
Cool. So you're currently not a student, but that's not enough to keep you out of the classroom because you're a teacher's assistant for basically a world history class. How did you end up in that position?
I actually kind of got lucky in the sense that I happened to hear about it while I was working as a TA at SDSU. So some of my fellow TAs talked about how like one of their immediate like post graduation plans was to try to work at UCSD because uh, long story short, the way UCSD works is, say you're a sociology major and you're in the School of Social Sciences, right? And there's all these different schools for different majors. UCSD has that, but in addition to that, it has 6 different colleges that every student chooses to be a part of one of them. And so The college that I work for is called the Eleanor Roosevelt College. And so each college has a writing program that is just kind of like distinctly its own. Eleanor Roosevelt College's writing program is called Making of the Modern World, which is basically a world history course that is also an intensive writing course. And so, going back to what I said earlier about how like every college has their school, like within a normal school, there's always grad students within that school, within the majors within that school, right? Like if there's a school of social sciences, you have grad students for sociology, for political science, economics, et cetera, right?
Right.
And so their need for graduate students and teaching assistants is always about even. And say maybe there's like a small shortage of TAs here, or like people to work as TAs in one department, but there's an abundance of people to work in another department. It evens out, and so you can have, say, like an econ grad student TAing a poli sci class or something. However, at UCSD, uh, with those colleges that I mentioned, including Eleanor Roosevelt College, there's not actually like you can't major in making of the modern world, and so there's no graduate students that are attached to that college, and so they hired non-student TAs at UCSD for that reason. Whereas at pretty much every other UC, unfortunately, they don't hire non-student TAs, and so I just kind of got lucky both in hearing about it and in happening to live next to the one UC that actually hires non-student TAs.
Yeah, talk about right time and right place.
Exactly.
So, what exactly do you do as a TA? I know you just kind of covered some stuff, but like, what's the day to day look like there?
So during more normal times, we plan our curriculum for our sections completely. So we lead a discussion section uh, once or twice a week, depending on the sequence that we're in, because it's a 5 sequence course, and so during some of those steps of the course, you meet once a week in the first, fourth, and fifth sequences
And sorry to
of the course.
interrupt, but is this for at the college level? Is
Uh, yeah, yeah. So
That's what I understood. Because there are teachers' assistants for high schools as well. And I remember in my high school, there were, I think, one or two teachers that had a assistant that helped them out. So, but yeah, this is at the college level. So sorry about that. Continue on if you could.
No, no, that's a good distinction to make because I do know actually UCSD does work with a lot of local high schools. So yeah, so the making of the modern world classes are for college students, and so basically what I'm doing in my sections is I am lesson planning discussions, I am grading student work, I am having department meetings, I am keeping up with everything. But I mean, like ultimately, like in regard to my students, the main thing is planning and leading the discussion sections that are based
Cool.
on like the readings and the lectures in the course.
Cool. Um, is this something that you could see yourself doing for a while, or do you have other career ideas in mind that you'd like to talk about?
I could theoretically see myself doing it for a while. I do enjoy it. The only issue is there's no real job security
Mm,
because you get rehired from quarter to quarter. So in a way, you're kind of like a contract worker.
mm-hmm.
I would ideally like to become a full-time professor at a community college where I could teach like U.S. and Latin American history and everything, and maybe even world history because I've been basically like helping teach it for the last 2 years. And so I'd love to do that, and then I'd also, of course, love for my podcast to take off. But even in a hypothetical world where like my podcast was like super big and enough to live off of, I would actually still like to be an educator on top of all that, just because I love being in the classroom.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Bart Ehrman situation. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's made quite a bit of money off of this, but he still works his job that he likes to do, but he also has a podcast and other stuff like some sort of he basically like all the money that he makes off of his public talks and debates and stuff he donates to charity, and he
That's
lives
awesome.
off of his actual job. So it's kind of a cool position to be in to be able to do that. Let's talk about your podcast. It's called A Mouthful of History. What how did you come up with that name?
So I have the podcast with two friends of mine, Nick and Cameron, and our goal for the podcast basically is to kind of balance being like fun and interesting and conversational, like with getting people to think critically about the past and applying it to the present and everything. But we wanted to make sure that like our name and also the kind of like just general vibe that we give off isn't super like boring or stuffy sounding. And so you can't say like the title A Mouthful of History and think of something like super serious. Like that's obviously a silly name. And so we kind of wanted to convey that it'd be like something fun and conversational while we're talking about it.
Yeah, it's a cool name. It definitely makes you think about like people speaking and sort of engaging with each other, and it's a mouthful to talk about history. There's a lot to talk about there, and I think that it's great that you're kind of trying to bring together the fun side of it, but also the serious side where you want people to be thinking critically, but you also want them to have a good laugh about stuff too, because there's a lot of humor to be found in just about every corner of the world. So, what really inspired it? What can you tell us about some of the episodes or the content that is in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have our actual podcast itself. And so we have done 4 episodes so far. Our first one is about US presidential elections, where each of the three of us basically choose an election that we think is like interesting or important in some way. And then we talk about why. And so I talked about the 1972 election between Richard Nixon and George McGovern because I feel like there's a lot of things that like have become conventional political and historical knowledge that I don't think is necessarily accurate or fair. And so I talked about that. So that was our first episode. And my other 2 podcast mates, by the way, one talked about the election of 1800, another talked about the election of 1988.
No
So that
one
was our
talked about
first one.
Truman versus Dewey.
No, although that could be a fun one in the future because I was thinking as I was like doing the research for it, I was like, there's a lot of really interesting and important elections. So there could definitely be a sequel to
And that
that
one's
one.
been covered so many times too. The ones that you've mentioned, I haven't seen those get much attention. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it was fun to record too and talk about. So we had that one, and then we actually had a 2-part series about the Normans, which our member Cameron he chose that one,
Hmm.
and so that one, I mean, it's like a lecture, but like a fun conversational lecture because he is really doing a great amount of the work in that episode, and he's just really laying it all out about the Normans.
Do you guys
And then
go
our
into
most
their
recent
history?
episode. Oh, sorry, what?
Do you go into their history and like the origins of Mormonism, or what kind of
Sorry,
content?
Normans.
Normans. I see. I thought you were saying Mormons. So
Yeah, my
those are
bad.
definitely two completely unrelated. Well, not completely unrelated, but two totally different groups. The
Very different,
Normans
yeah.
and the Mormons. Yes. Yep. So yeah, that's
And
cool.
yeah, and then our most recent one that we actually are like kind of in the process of dropping right now. I think we just put it on the platform. I don't handle the technical side of things. We just put it on the podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts and stuff like that. We haven't uploaded to YouTube yet. But it is about the U.S. frontier, like as an idea, and how the idea of the frontier kind of played a different role in the like imagination and politics of U.S. history for both good and bad. And so that episode like kind of just dropped.
I see.
So that's our podcast, and then every week I do a just like a solo video myself where I answer different questions about history. And so I've answered questions like why is history important? Does history repeat itself? Just things like that. So I drop one of those every week, and then other than that, we'll just do like random posts.
What do you think? Does it repeat itself?
A saying that I've always liked
Did
is
Egyptians have helicopters?
sorry.
Did Egyptians have helicopters?
No, they had tanks. No, a saying that I've always liked is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so like there are these sorts of problems and ideas that come up a lot. They're never exactly the same, but if you study history, you're still going to be really well informed and have a good grasp of like different things people have struggled with in the past and how they've tried to like alleviate those problems can kind of give you ideas of like what to do and what not to do in the present. It's almost kind of like to use a fighting metaphor, because that's another thing that I'm really well versed in, like if you were looking for a good boxing coach, you wouldn't want a boxing coach who's never watched a fight before. Because, like, maybe you have a fight upcoming with an opponent, and no two fighters are exactly the same, but your opponent is going to bring stuff to the table. And if your coach has, like, watched footage of similar fighters, that can literally only be helpful.
Yeah, right. Definitely to have an extensive background in the area that you're looking into, to have people that are competent in a wide range of knowledge. And it can actually be kind of difficult to find sometimes, especially when you're starting to get into those higher degrees and those specialized fields where people sort of, it's them and maybe a handful of others that can even understand what they're talking about. So, yeah, definitely uh, an interesting perspective there. So, do you have any other plans or events coming up related to your podcast, maybe, or just related to history in general?
So I'm actually working on a book, just a pretty short one actually, and it's called How We Got Here. And it is attempting to answer the question how we got to this point in history, and kind of specifically like U.S. history. Although I go back before the founding of the country, even before colonization. So I kind of like briefly touch on things like, the origin of humankind, kind of getting into anthropology a little bit, also talking about some of the stuff that I found like interesting and relevant from my last couple of years at MMW, so talking about world history, and then just transitioning gradually from there to the present.
I see. So, do you go back like as far as possible, like to like the first civilizations, or when people started messing with fire?
Yeah, I basically, after I get to kind of our anthropological origins, I talk about exactly that, sort of humans as hunter gatherers for a little bit. And this is like, my chapters for this book are like 3 to 5 pages, just very general summaries, like really written for like a general audience. There's no like jargon or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like that chapter about our anthropological origins, and then just talking a couple pages about us as hunter gatherers, then talking about the importance of like the agricultural revolution, the use of agriculture, like allowing for there to be surplus, allowing for like people to get other roles other than just farmers and stuff, and just kind of going through different stages, pointing to different things I find interesting in world history, and different things I find relevant to the present, and then just kind of gradually, working my way to the founding of the U.S. and working my way through like U.S. history and history of other parts of the world too, like when it seems relevant, just to land us squarely in the present. And so I'm about a third of the way through the book now, and once the school year ends, I'll be like really just delving into it.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds like definitely a book targeted at the layman, the general public, possibly even like kids or teenagers, to sort of get an idea on what some of these ideas are, you know, to get an idea of the idea. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. Like my book would be entirely just a starting point, just trying to get people interested in different, aspects of history and stuff, but not any way like authoritative or scholarly. Just, a jumping off point with some interesting main ideas from different time periods.
cool. So, we're about to wrap up here, but I want to give everybody a chance to leave a message for people that are just getting interested. So, like, almost kind of like what your book is, aimed at the people that are just sort of getting interested in history as a hobby or a career. If you were to give a message to those people, and you get the chance right now, what is your message to those newcomers to the historical realms?
My message is that history is for everyone. If you're listening to this podcast, that's really cool. Don't ever let anyone tell you that, like, you have to have like a PhD to care about history or something. I mean, like 99.9% of the students that I've TA'd for and worked with, both at UCSD and at SDSU, are not history majors. And that's cool because I think what would be ideal is if, folks were thinking historically about things, connecting the past to the present. And, you don't need a degree for that. So, again, it's great that you're listening to something like this. And I would encourage you just to find subjects that you find really interesting and just look into them and ask why you find it interesting and just see how you can see connections between whatever subject you're studying in the present.
So really just to dig right in, find something that you really enjoy and just dig into it and see what you can come up with.
Exactly. Well put.
Awesome. Well, David, thanks for joining me today. I had a pleasure speaking with you.
Right back at you, man. Thanks for having me.
So, for everybody that's made it to the end of this episode, I will have a link to David's podcast in the description to this video. I will also have a link to the Ctruth Patreon channel where you can get access to exclusive content from Ctruth for $1 a month. There's a bunch of videos in another series different from this one. You can vote on topics for the article of the month, and you also get a free topic for an article of your choice when you sign up. So check that out if you're interested. And other than that, this concludes episode 13. So take care.
Stay safe, everyone.